Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Spanish octopus. That's right, not only is this recipe Spanish, but the actual octopus I used was Spanish as well. Which is great because as far as I'm concerned, you can never have too much Spanish involved in a recipe. Those people know how to eat. And what I find most surprising about octopus, besides that it's not more popular, is just how many tips and tricks exist for how to cook it tender. Which I really don't understand, because if you just simply braise it until it's tender, you don't need any tricks or tips. So that's going to be our approach. And we'll begin by putting together our very simple braising liquid. So into this saucepan we will toss in 1 chopped Spanish onion, also known as your common yellow onion from the market. We'll also toss in 3 or 4 peeled and slightly crushed garlic cloves, as well as a couple bay leaves, and a nice generous spoon of Spanish paprika. And then we'll finish this off with a nice big pinch of salt, as well as a healthy drizzle of olive oil. Extra credit if it's Spanish. And then what we're going to do is turn our heat on to medium-high and cook this mixture, stirring occasionally for about 5 minutes or so, or just until those onions start to soften up and kind of turn translucent. And then once that happens, we will introduce our one and only braising liquid here, a relatively small amount of white wine. And as usual, I always say use something drinkable. And while that's partially because we want something decent in the recipe, but more importantly, it's because we're going to need to drink the rest of the bottle. So as always, nothing sold by the name cooking wine should be used. And what we'll do is stir that in and wait for it to come up to a simmer. And as soon as it does, our braising liquid is now ready for the octopus. And there's mine. That is a 1-pound piece of Spanish octopus. And by piece I mean arm. Or is it leg? Let's go with appendage. And in case you're wondering, that is almost always imported frozen and then thawed before being sold. And what we'll do is go ahead and transfer that into our braising liquid. And we'll sort of toss it around to get it acquainted with all the other ingredients. And what we'll do once that's been accomplished is simply turn our heat to low and then cook this covered for about an hour or so, or until it's tender. And that's it. It really is that simple. We did not beat the octopus on a rock before we put it in here, nor are we going to add wine corks, or any of the other crazy tricks people do. If we simply cook this gently using this shallow braise method, eventually it will get just as tender as we want, which by the way is somewhere between rubbery and mushy. And the only other thing I like to do is about halfway through, after about 20 or 30 minutes, I like to uncover it and turn it over, because as you can see it's not fully submerged in the liquid. So we'll give that a flip, and then we'll cover that back up and simply continue braising until it's exactly as tender as we want. And as usual, the only way to know that is by giving it the old poka-poka. And for that testing, you probably should really use a small sharp knife versus this wooden skewer I used, since for whatever reason the texture of the octopus really seems to grab onto that wooden skewer and makes it look and feel like it's a lot tougher than it is. But anyway, I did give it a test and determined it needed to cook for a little bit longer. And by the way, like most recipes where I give it time, please only use that as a rough guide and test for yourself. Okay, you are after all the Poseidon of deciding when this is done. And depending on the size and quantity of the octopus you're using, this could take a lot less or a lot more time. But as I mentioned, mine ended up taking about an hour. Although you really couldn't tell by watching this test, since it looks super tough. But it really wasn't. I could tell that meat was just tender, which is why I turned off the heat and transferred that into a bowl. And I should mention, if you're the kind of person that would get concerned about a slimy purple skin, don't be. That's totally normal, and we're going to wipe off most of that when this is cold anyway. Speaking of which, you can eat this right away, but I think it's actually better if we let this cool in its own juices, which is why I'm going to pour those over, and then sort of spoon it over the octopus for no apparent reason. And then once this is cooled down, I'll wrap it up and pop it in the fridge until thoroughly chilled, or even better, overnight. And even though people keep telling me I can put warm things in the fridge, I guess old habits die hard. So I did place this on an ice bath to cool down a little quicker, at which point I did in fact wrap it up and leave it overnight. So yes, if you want this today, make sure you start it yesterday. And then what we'll do once we're ready for final service is go ahead and unwrap it and pull it out of that relatively disgusting looking mixture, which you definitely don't want to throw away, because what we'll do is bring that to a boil and strain it and use that as a base for our sauce. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because first we have to prep and then sear/char the surface of this octopus. So what we'll do first is take a paper towel and wipe off as much of that purple slimy skin as we want, which is probably almost all of it. And I actually did do a little more than I'm showing here, since you really can only watch so much of this kind of thing. But anyway, we'll go ahead and de-slimify the surface, and then cut this into 3 or 4 smaller, easier to work with pieces. And even though I'm about to sear this for this recipe, if you want, you can eat this cold by slicing it thin and using it in some kind of composed salad. And after all these years, I still haven't decided whether I like it better this way or hot. It really is amazing done both ways. So if you do want to serve this chilled, just slice it thin and dress it as you see fit. And even without a dressing, that was so delicious, I almost stopped and ate the rest. It really was fantastic. But I resisted and went ahead and finished cleaning those up, at which point I gave them a little brushing with olive oil. And you could, if you want, give them a little sprinkling of salt. But those cold pieces I just tasted seem to be seasoned perfectly. So I'm just going to simply brush them with olive oil. At which point we want to sear these very aggressively in a very hot pan or equally hot grill pan. And for me, if you have one of these panini presses work perfectly. Okay, thanks to that weight on top, we're going to get a beautiful sear and a gorgeous caramelization bordering on charred, which is not a mistake. That really is how far you want to go. Which reminds me, this stuff is perfect outside on your charcoal grill. But anyway, what we're going to do is sear those for 3 or 4 minutes per side, or until the outside looks like this. And of course, since I really like to play with my food, once both sides have been nicely caramelized, I generally just sort of toss them around until I'm satisfied those are heated through. At which point we will pull those off and move into final plating. So what we'll do is set that aside for just a minute while we make our sauce, which I guess is more of a dressing. And to make that, we'll take some of our boiled strained braising liquid and add some freshly squeezed lemon juice, a little bit of olive oil, and some freshly chopped Italian parsley. And by the way, you see how that whisk is blocking the shot? That's the reason I have not won a James Beard Award yet. I mean, there's other reasons, but that's one of them. But anyway, we'll whisk that together and check for seasoning, which mine didn't need because that liquid was already so flavorful. And once that's set, we can go ahead and slice up our octopus into some smaller, more attractive pieces. And I went ahead and served that on some beautiful, crusty roasted potatoes. And then we'll finish this up by spooning over our sauce. And by the way, if you don't feel like boiling and straining that braising liquid, this is still going to be great with just olive oil and lemon juice. But using some of those reserved cooking liquids really does elevate this dish. And then to make this official, we'll dust it with a little bit of cayenne, as well as a possibly gratuitous parsley sprig. And that's it. What I'm calling Spanish octopus is done. And above and beyond the hopefully perfectly tender texture, the flavor of octopus is surprisingly mild and meaty. Right, if you've never had it before, I guess it's similar to calamari. But for me, a little bit sweeter and a little bit richer. But that could be just because we're biting into a bigger piece of it versus those little skinny rings. But anyway, just an absolutely delicious thing to eat. Plus, it has suction cups on it. So you got that going for you, which is nice. Oh, and I'm not exactly sure why potatoes are such a perfect combo with octopus, but they are. Just an amazing pairing. And as awesome as those big chunks of octopus are, the smaller, skinnier, even more caramelized pieces might be even more enjoyable. If I can get it on the fork. See, it knows we're talking about it. There we go. But anyway, that's it. How I do Spanish octopus. You don't really need any secret tips and tricks. Just cook it till it's tender, sear it on a hot pan or grill, and enjoy one of the world's most underappreciated foods. I mean, come on, why isn't this on every menu? Probably the suction cups. But anyway, if you can find some Spanish octopus, which you can, I really hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.